Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Potential of Broad-Based Employee Ownership, featuring Pete Stavros, partner and co-head of America's Private Equity at KKR, as well as the founder of the Center for Shared Ownership. Tonight's event will be a speech, followed by Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question for Pete, please do so using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It should be in the bottom panel button you can click. Without further ado, I'd like to now turn it over to Nan J. Morrison, President and CEO of the Council for Economic Education, for her opening remarks. Nan?
Thanks, Thomas, and thank you all so much for joining us this spring evening. We're also thirsty this year for spring, for bounty, for community, for live events. And yet, I've grown fond of these virtual events. They allow us to stay in touch with all of you on a more frequent basis and introduce you to some of the fine minds within our sphere, minds who inform and guide our work, thinkers and doers whom I hope you will relish as much as we do. We are enormously privileged to be joined this evening by Pete Stavros, hailed as a change agent in the world of finance and one of our honorees for this year's Visionary Awards benefit on June 9th. Change agency is something to which we at CE also aspire, so Pete's participation here and his overall engagement with us is both satisfying and challenging, mostly satisfying, altogether inspiring. CE's goal is to make economics and personal finance part of the natural vocabulary for all of our kids, a way for them to solve problems, map their futures, and fulfill their own potentials, wherever those may lie. We demonstrate to kids that the world is comprehensible, that there are concrete skill sets for negotiating it and building good lives. We show them that economics and personal finance are not scary subjects, pointing to deficiencies or limits. Instead, these subjects are guides, Sherpas, to the fruitful plain. CE takes a multi-pronged, leave no stone unturned approach. We train teachers and develop solid, relevant, and free resources for them. We create innovative programs to reach overlooked kids and communities. We bring families into the learning experience with their kids. And we advocate with leaders across our nation to get these subjects into our schools, K through 12. In sum, CE is in our classrooms and communities with new ideas, creating more access and delivering what works. Delivering what works is the endless labor of leveraging every single tool possible for success, however small or large, conventional or unconventional, staying focused on our values and translating those into value for kids. And this is the territory that Pete Stavros is mapping as co-head of US Private Equity at KKR, the 200 billion plus global investment firm. Pete is focused on the manufacturing and industrial sectors, improving employee lives and investment returns. I'm so enthusiastic about what Pete and his team are accomplishing that it sent me back to read another Peter, Peter Drucker, the father of modern corporate management theory. One of his key insights was that the worker is simply not a cost, but an asset. Or as this Pete would say, investing in employees pays for itself. Another insight from Drucker, corporations should be organized to fulfill automatically their social obligations in the very act of seeking their own best self-interest. He wrote that about 50 years ago, and we're still working it out. Pete Stavros is acting on it today. What has struck me in listening to Pete Stavros' story and hearing about his work is the role of one foundational value, respect for the dignity of the worker. Listening with respect to workers, creating value through engaging with them, and giving them more agency in shaping the future of their workplace, profit sharing, and financial education. It is transformational. Well, I think it's probably time to let Pete get a word in here and tell his story himself. Over to you.
Thanks, Nan, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity to tell the story a little bit. I hope my video comes through okay. Our Wi-Fi here in upstate New York is hit or miss, so hopefully this all goes smoothly. You know, I met Nan as a part of our broad-based ownership model. One of the things that we do is extend financial literacy training to all of our colleagues at our companies where we deploy this broad-based ownership model. And you know, we had always looked for and thought about an upstream way to really have impact from a financial education literacy perspective. So within a company, we share ownership broadly. We extend financial literacy training into the company, and then we thought, what can we do, you know, upstream? And that's where CEE comes in, and we're so proud to be associated with the organization. So I thought I would share my screen and tell you a little bit about the Center for Shared Ownership. that we are in the process of launching. It will be up and running in the summer. Worst case, early fall, going as fast as we can. And Nan, is that coming through okay? Great. So this is, I won't take you through maybe each and every slide, but this is a slide deck I've been using with some foundations. We've been raising some initial capital from. The Center for Shared Ownership is really an entity, as I'll describe, that we're setting up to try and spread, basically try and spread this model of shared prosperity inside of companies, and both in the private markets and in the public markets, make sure lower income employees have a chance to build wealth for themselves, just as senior executive officers do in both private equity backed companies, public companies, family owned businesses, et cetera. So the agenda here is to discuss the potential for broad-based ownership if done at scale. I'm a fan of ESOPs and co-ops, but for the most part, those have tended to be the purview of small business, and this is an opportunity to really take this to business at scale. I'll review two employee ownership case studies, and then I'll talk about this new Center for Shared Ownership. I'm going to skip the last part because this is not a fundraising request. This is just sharing some information and hopefully having a good discussion. So my personal journey with this starts with my dad. My dad was an hourly construction worker in Chicago. He's a union guy. This is actually a picture of my dad. Operated a road grader for 45 years. And growing up, my sister and I saw kind of the plight of the low-income worker, what it's like to get paid by the hour and have a massive misalignment of incentives with your employer, where your employer is constantly trying to squeeze down the number of hours you're working and you want more hours. And there were just a lot of kind of weird situations that popped up as a result of that misalignment. As one example, my dad and his colleagues used to fight with their employer over, would I get paid for the drive time to the job site? What about the drive home? What about the lunch hour? Do I get my hour? And it was never really a discussion about quality, doing the job on time, productivity, doing the job on budget. My dad would come home and he would say, they took the lunch hour away from us this week, and now we've already gone on strike. That didn't work. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have all of the road aggregate and the raw materials delivered right at the lunch hour so that we can refuse delivery and intentionally run the job out of material. Can you believe this is what we're doing? And as opposed to having an incentive to be aligned with my employer, all we're doing is fighting over hours. So anyway, my dad always pushed for profit sharing in his union, never got it done, unfortunately, but that really stuck with me, left an impression. And I carried that into my adulthood. And when I became an investor, one of the first things I worked on happened to be an ESOP called Gleason Corporation. That really captured my imagination. I'd never heard of that before. The concept of sharing ownership broadly, it really took me back to my childhood and my dad. And that just lit a fire. And when I went to business school, had a chance to study ESOPs and the history of private equity with ESOPs in great detail. And then when I got into a leadership role at KKR, I got to experiment with forms of broad-based ownership, really outside of ESOPs, because ESOPs at scale, for reasons we can discuss in the Q&A if you're interested, there's some challenges with them. So that's a little bit of my personal journey. The potential here, I think, is significant. The potential for the distributing wealth more broadly, addressing the racial wealth gap, aligning incentives between employers and their employees. And in some small sense, it could contribute to a greater sense of social cohesion if people felt like they had a stake in the system, which many today do not. So in terms of how did we get here, this is some Federal Reserve data that I find fascinating. There's a lot of talk about wealth inequality being a new thing. It's not a new phenomenon, not if you're in the bottom half of the country in terms of wealth. If you look at the left side here, this shows the wealth held by the bottom half, both in 1989, the first year I could get Fed data, and in 2020. And you can see the bottom half has not owned much in the way of assets, really, for as long as this data has been around. And if you look here around corporate equities, this really screwed us up. To have the bottom half of the country own only 1% of equities in 1989, and then have equities double every 10 years in value, that's where you get to the right. The bottom 50% created over all of these years, 150 billion of value. and the top 10% created 25 trillion of value. So there was just a lack of exposure to equities for half the country that really got us in this position. Now, from a racial equity perspective, this is a big opportunity to share ownership more broadly. If you look at this is, I would say, very typical in terms of the demographics of companies in the country. You've got a limited number of Blacks and Hispanics in L1, L2, L3, and then an overrepresentation of Blacks and Hispanics at the bottom of organizations. So clearly, over time, we need to diversify the tops of these companies. That's obviously the big goal. But in the immediate term, if we spread ownership broadly, we will be significantly disproportionately benefiting racial minorities who have been left behind. So the combination of a lack of diversity at the top, plus that being the only place where ownership goes, is unfortunately a big supporter of racial inequity. And so I think this is a big opportunity. And one of our foundational sponsors here, Ford Foundation, I think this is one of the reasons that really this whole concept appeals to them. So then there's the opportunity to have stronger companies. I don't think this is the reason to do it. I think we should share ownership broadly because it's the right thing to do. Also happens to be good business. If you look at Gallup, which is the 800-pound gorilla in employee surveys, the data around employee engagement in the United States is pretty terrible. 54% of the country not engaged on the job, 14% on top of that actively disengaged, which they define as effectively trying to sabotage their employer. In terms of how, what's happening with populism, why is there this uprising? Part of it is economics, which we've talked about, part of it's politics. Then there's this community aspect where you can feel, even inside of an individual company, how divided we are. A lot of the great jobs that used to be in manufacturing locations have left and have been consolidated in corporate centers. And what's left behind are the truly blue collar jobs and a very limited number of salaried roles, and all the other jobs moved to corporate centers. And so this is a company that I'm chairperson of called Ingersoll Rand. And over many, many years, the jobs have become consolidated again in corporate centers. And what's left behind are a lot of folks living below the poverty line, opioid crises, et cetera. So even within an individual company, you can kind of feel how divided the country is. So what are we going to do about it? On the encouraging side, the country is still looking to the business world to do something. And if you look at what Americans say about who should have responsibility for addressing this, a majority of Americans do think business has a big role to play, and CEOs in particular have a role to play in addressing societal issues, including wealth inequality. But despite our best efforts here and everything we've been talking about in terms of the new statement of corporate purpose, et cetera, haven't really done anything, haven't come forward with any concrete proposals around wealth inequality. And this is just the Edelman Trust Barometer. This is a little bit encouraging. Again, business, all of these move left and down over the years. The public loses trust in all of us, but the business community is still viewed as ethical and competent. And so it feels like we've got a shot to do something. So that's a little bit of the backdrop. I'll hit two case studies. The first one focused really around the culture building aspect of broad-based ownership, what this can mean for a company when employees are treated differently. So this is a company that we made an investment in a number of years ago. They make overhead garage doors like the one you see here in the picture. They're based in central Illinois. When we acquired the business, there were 800 employees from top to bottom, each one represented here by a dot. The light blue dots, hourly workers in the plant, those were 600 of the 800. Another 54 truck drivers paid by the mile, kind of similar to being paid by the hour. And then the purple dots, office workers who earn a salary but don't have ownership. So think of this as being, $50,000 to maybe $75,000 of an annual salary, but no ownership. And 18 out of 800 had ownership. So when we acquired the business, about 2% had ownership. 18 got a payout of about $60 million, and most of it went to two people. And this is a microcosm of corporate America. 2%, roughly have ownership, and everyone else kind of barely getting by. So we rolled out this model, expanding ownership to all employees. We do a ton of culture building work around financial education, personal financial literacy training. Now with Nan's help, taking a more holistic community-wide approach and going upstream around financial education, we shared the business plan, how we're going to create value in the company, start sharing key metrics, for example, in a factory. If our goal is scrap reduction, reporting out on that goal, how we're doing every day, every week, every month, and what it means for the business. We print physical stock certificates for employees. We've found that physical manifestation of ownership can make a real difference in people valuing the ownership. And then where we can, we pay dividends on the stock, again, trying to get people to understand this ownership is real, nothing like cash in the door to do that. Now, it can't just be about ownership if you're trying to build culture, because ownership, it is mostly, although not exclusively, a discussion about compensation. And so if you're trying to do more than that, yes, you got to open up the book, share data, share the business plan. You also need to invest in your people. Inside of a manufacturing plant, a lot of times safety falls by the wayside over the years. And this is an example where we walked into a business with a horrific safety record. You can see this is the injury rate measured per 100 workers per year, 14%, injured on the job every year, 3 times the OSHA benchmark. Through a lot of investment and good work by the leadership team, dropped that 65%. We've done some on-site financial literacy training here. John Hope Bryant of Operation Hope, visiting one of our businesses and providing an initial workshop, and then doing one-on-one financial counseling, as you would expect, how to apply for the earned income tax credit, the importance of getting out of debt, how to plan and save and budget, et cetera, everything that everyone associated with the CEE would have a lot of enthusiasm for. Then investing in the workforce, we delegate some admittedly limited, but some decision-making rights to our colleagues. So we will say in a manufacturing plant, as an example, $1 million a year of CapEx, of capital expenditures, we're going to ask you to nominate ideas of how to spend the money. We will then ask you to help us study those alternatives. You'll vote on the alternatives, and whatever you pick, we will do. We just ask that it makes the workplace a better environment, a better experience for the colleagues. And so they have picked, our colleagues have picked air conditioning in the plant, an on-site medical clinic we built last year. We built break rooms, healthy food options in the cafeteria, all sorts of different things, on-site gyms. Another thing we do is delegate decision-making rights over our community involvement. We say we will sponsor really any charitable activity. In this case, I think it is, again, up to about $1 million a year. We want it tied into the mission of the company, and we want you, our colleagues, to really drive it. So they had our colleagues had a bunch of ideas. We studied them, voted on them, and the colleagues chose Homes for Our Troops, which builds custom homes for wounded vets, like the one you see in the picture. We became the garage door supplier, in addition to a major financial sponsor. And then what's really cool is the employees got very involved and really drove it all. And this is a picture of some of our employees actually working at a site where a custom home was being built. And this is a source of pride, building pride really in the organization. So you do all these things, and what happens over time is the employee survey results go from horrifically bad, like this, where only 30% even care to respond. And most who do respond say the survey is going to have no impact because no one's going to listen to me. And 90% of the results are below benchmark. And 3 years later, these are significantly better. This is not a certified great place to work yet, but better. 80% respond as opposed to 30%, and 50% of results above benchmark as opposed to 90% below. So, it's a meaningful turnaround in 3 years. I wanted to play, this is about a 1-minute video, and it just gives you a sense for the enthusiasm that starts to build inside of the company as all of these changes take place. We invest in safety, invest in the facility, invest in the colleagues, start to get involved with the community. And this video is about the first dividend that we paid on the shares. And so all the colleagues in the manufacturing plant here participated to the tune of about $1,300 to $4,000. So not a tremendous amount of money, but enough to matter. And the message was, look, this is just a dividend. You're not selling any stock, and we can pay many more dividends over time if we keep performing. And in fact, we did. We paid 3 more dividends subsequent to this dividend. And on average, folks have made about $10,000 in dividends. And then when we sell the company, I think they'll make, many times that when they actually sell their stock. So I'll play this quick video, and then we can keep going. So if you've been here less than 2 years and you're full-time, we're paying $1,300. 2 to 4 years,
$2,400, and 4 years or more, almost $4,000. And these amounts. And the payout will happen, I think this is Friday, tomorrow.
When you have employees feel like they are part of the company, they do better, perform better.
So it makes you feel more empowered to talk to upper management and to make sure that you get heard with ideas that you have or thoughts that you may have about something.
I think it completely changed the way everybody thinks.
Which is obviously exactly what we're going for people to think differently about their role in the company and the role that they can play. By the way, it's an Amish community, so it's hard to get a lot of emotion out of them. That is as much as we've gotten. This is a second case study. This is a quick one. It's really focused exclusively on the wealth creation potential for broad-based ownership. So I'm not going to go through all the culture change and everything that we just discussed. Just going to get right to the economic potential of this for employees. This is what it looked like when we acquired the business. It's very similar to what I showed you for CHI overhead doors. Should have noted, by the way, this company makes safety equipment. So you see this gentleman on the wind tower, the equipment that he is wearing, which attaches him to the structure, is what this company makes. So 1,250 employees when we bought the business, 35, again, about 2% had ownership. Those 35 got a payout when we acquired the business of $160 million. Most of it went to 2 people. And then the vast majority of the workforce, barely getting by. So very similar story. So we rolled out this new model. And when we fast forwarding now to the end, in the interest of time, when we sold, it was an amazing outcome for our investors and also for all the employees. So we had hundreds of people make more than $100,000. We had 44 make more than $1 million. So we had more people make $1 million than even participated in the equity prior to our involvement. And the top 2 actually made more money in this round than they did in the prior one. So having a smaller percentage of a bigger pie actually worked. So this is the only other video I'll play. It's, again, very brief, but this is some footage that was captured when we sold the business. This is inside of our Red Wing, Minnesota manufacturing plant. We had announced we were selling the company to 3M. At the time, this was the largest acquisition 3M had ever made. And then this announcement was what their equity was worth. This is the first time they hear the news, what their equity was worth.
When the announcement was made, we were listening, and when he said the amount, my heart stopped. I looked around at all of the people that I knew, and some of them were crying. And I knew how much some of them really needed help. And it was just really touching to see. And I think I was more excited for everyone else than I even was for myself. One girl, who's a single mom of 2, had never had a new car, and she was 45 years old, and she got a brand new car, her first one ever, and she was so excited. And there was another girl who had been married for about, I think, 4 years, and she and her husband had never had a honeymoon, and they went on a honeymoon.
To see people jumping for joy, tears of joy, coming up and hugging you because of this great news that you're able to give them, it really was one of the most rewarding days I think I will ever have in my life.
And that, I would say, was one of the more unexpected parts about deploying this model, was the impact it had on the leadership team. We hear very frequently from CEOs and leaders like the gentleman in that video who say, that's the most impactful thing I've done in my life, leading our lower income colleagues to wealth creation, to have a shot at a dignified retirement, et cetera. So it's become a huge recruiting tool. There's a big servant aspect to leadership that I think people lose over time. And this is an opportunity to really resuscitate that. And we've found the leadership of these companies, they run to this. And once they do it, they want to do it again. And they want to bring other people along in the journey. Now, I normally don't point this out, but because of the audience, I'm going to point this out. That video, that video is from years ago. but it's very moving and it's a great story. But many of those colleagues should have been paying down debt. And if you listen to the stories of somebody bought a new car, took a honeymoon, you know, that they couldn't take when they got married, that was we were not prepared for that. That was one of the early times we had a big payout in one of our companies, and we did not done a good job of preparing folks. And so that was a lesson. I don't often talk about this, but that was a lesson that we learned. And that's where financial literacy training really came into play. And the moment that it clicked for me, and I'm embarrassed to say it took me this long to figure this out. We were walking through a manufacturing plant. We had paid a number of dividends on the stock, and one of the hourly employees that I'd gotten to know came up to me, tears in his eyes. He was going to lose his house. I was like, how is that possible? We've paid all these dividends on the stock. Business is doing great. You've got, you know, I know more income than you've ever had and all these dividends. How is this possible? And he's like, well, I bought a truck. I helped my brother buy a truck. And that was the moment of like, oh my God. And this, we had already exited this business and I'd already seen this video. And that was like, holy cow, we got to be way more responsible in preparing people for these payouts. Anyway, I normally don't go into all that detail, but given the audience, thought I would share that. So I'm going to go through the rest of this a little bit more quickly. This movement suddenly has gotten a lot of momentum. Obviously, very honored by the Council for Economic Education recognizing our work. Our main industry trade journal, Private Equity International, has recognized it. We've had some of the key business schools recognize it and start to write case studies and study what we've been doing. And this just feels like a moment to us. You know, COVID has really shined a bright light on the inequities in our economy and society. Hourly workers were the first to lose their jobs in COVID. If they didn't lose their jobs, they had to risk their health to show up in person and work in close contact with others. So it's just kind of a deeply unfair economy, and this is a way to bring some more fairness to it. And it feels like a moment in time where we can make some progress. And whatever your political leanings, we've got a unified government that seems like they want to do something. So in terms of what this nonprofit is going to do, there's three parts to it. There's serving as a hands-on practical resource for companies that want to, you know, go on this journey, whether they're private companies, private equity owned, family owned, public companies, et cetera. There's a lot, you know, to figure out in terms of tax implications, accounting implications. What are my shareholders going to say if I'm a public company? How should I deal with vesting and retention requirements? And how do I explain it to people? And all of that stuff, we've figured a lot of that out over the years. And then how do you build culture inside of the company using this as a platform? That's the first part. The second part is trying to stitch together the broader employee ownership community and build a movement. So there's, you know, people who are in the ESOP camp, there's the co-ops, there's academics out there, there's philanthropists out there. There's a number of people who have an interest in this, but there's never really been someone at the center or an entity at the center, in my view, kind of stitching the whole thing together. And I'll talk about that. And then we're trying to build a movement, trying to inspire others to do this, all with a goal towards creating 10 billion of wealth for low-income employees over the next decade. I know we can do that. We're approaching $1 billion already, just in what we've done so far. And so if we can bring others along with us, I know we can make that happen. So I'm going to skip through some of these. This is a public company that we helped do this. Harley Davidson. I'd say one of the cool parts was, you know, everyone has been in favor of it. I think with the board, you kind of don't know if you're a board member, what's going to you know, how the shareholders are going to react, how the research analyst community is going to react, et cetera. And it's all been positive, including with the union. Okay, so sorry, moving on here. This is the concept of stitching together the broader effort. I kind of touched on this a little bit, but just to give you a sense for what I mean, you know, there's lots of employee ownership going on in different forms. And the concept is, at the Center for Shared Ownership, whether you're Harley Davidson or whomever, we'll help you take this journey. We just want some data. We're not going to charge anything for it, but we would like, as a baseline, what's your employee turnover, your employee engagement scores. We'd like, you know, to understand your safety record, some detail on your equity plans, et cetera. Absenteeism, where it's relevant. And then let's go on this journey and let's see how we can move the data over time. And with enough data, you know, we're probably going to be working with some folks at Harvard. There's a very interesting joint venture between Stanford and MIT called JPAL that runs very sophisticated randomized control experiments that we're talking to. Figure out the best way to do this, because I could tell you we're in the third inning of figuring out how to do this well in terms of how do you, the most effective way to share ownership and share upside, communicate it, et cetera. And then we'll work with all of these other constituents and try and really build a movement. So, and along the way, we're going to experiment with all of these things. There's different ways to share ownership, different ways to invest in your colleagues in the workforce. How do you best educate your employees? How do you bring in worker voice into the company? We don't have all the answers, and these are all things we want to experiment with. And I think this entity could serve as a standard setting body in the ownership world. You know, there's a very technical type of sharing ownership, this ESOP I mentioned earlier. The nice thing about that is it's standardized. What we're doing here is not standardized. And I think what could damage the movement is if people start to copy this in a fake way. You know, like, yeah, sure, we're sharing ownership, and they share a token amount. They don't bring worker voice into the company, et cetera. That would be damaging. So I think having some standards, and maybe this entity could be the, you know, stamp of approval that you're an employee-owned business. And then there's a bunch of stuff going on in terms of how, you know, social media campaigns we're going to develop, and a podcast, and there'll be a story in the Wall Street Journal tomorrow or the next day about a business that we're going to, the foundation's going to put over $1 million into creating a really good documentary film to follow the leadership team and the employees over a 5-year journey of converting to employee ownership. You know, there'll be the great moments like you saw in those videos, but there's also tricky moments of when the CEO opens up the business plan to all employees, and, you know, hourly employees who are making $15 or $20 an hour, people like my dad who say, wait a minute, how is this fair? I can't believe this company's making $150 million of profit, and how am I making $15 to $20 an hour? So there are tricky discussions and decisions that happen that we also want captured on film to give people an honest view of what is this like. So I'm very excited about that. And like I said, there should be a story in the next couple days on that. Here's what the nonprofit lingo, I think, is theory of change. I often get, what's your theory of change? So I've learned a little bit about that. And as best I can explain it, I'm trying to orchestrate basically a big domino effect where, you know, my partners internally have been very supportive, particularly my co-head of private equity, Nate Taylor. We are now, and my partner in industrials, Josh Weisenbeck, we are spreading this, you know, hopefully, knock on wood, across our firm, getting other partners to understand how we do it and why it works. And, you know, if we get to a point where KKR is able to say, hey, look, this is how we do business. Prosperity is shared broadly inside of our companies. We create wealth creation opportunities for the least well-off among us. And this is the only way we do it. And if you get to that point, I just think there's going to be a domino effect in terms of, you know, Blackstone, Carlyle, TPG. I mean, I think there'll be a number of private equity firms who say, hey, we want to be a part of this. And then in the public markets, Ingersoll Rand, you know, we've distributed $400 million of stock to low-income workers. Nothing like that's ever been done. We've got over 10,000 employee owners today. Everyone's an owner in the business. Harley Davidson took an initial step, which we helped with. And I'm working with other public companies who are considering this. And then I'm also talking to the ESG leaders at all the big public investors, you know, trying to get people like BlackRock, Fidelity, T. Rowe, Franklin, Wellington, UBS, et cetera, to say, hey, when we score you for ESG, yes, the environment's critical, but we care about S. And so we want to know, what are you doing for your low-income employees? Part of that can be financial education, but part of it also needs to be sharing upside, sharing opportunity. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. I'm going to skip over this, but I've got a bunch of ideas on what we could do from a government perspective in terms of disclosures, legislation, tax incentives. This is our funding model. My wife and I are going to fund it. We pretty much raised all the money. There's a couple of slots I've kept open, as Nan knows, for folks that I really would like to have come into this. But we've got some banks, some consulting firms. We've got some great foundations like Forward Foundation who are going to be big sponsors, and then some high-profile business leaders who can not only provide some guidance but help draw attention to this. And I think I'll stop there. There's a staffing model and some other boring things. Maybe actually I'll hit on this real quick. Some considerations. You know, I'm definitely not here saying this is the answer to all of our problems. I think this can help. I think it's something we should do as a financial community, but it's not perfect. First of all, from a societal perspective at the bottom, you know, this is tweaking a system that's not working. So I'm definitely, we need broader changes. There's gonna have to be tax changes, et cetera. So I'm not saying this is gonna solve all of our problems. At the company level as well, I always neglect to say this, but the hourly employees and the low income colleagues do not buy this equity. It's free equity. So there's no downside, but the ultimate value of it and the upside is also uncertain. This is not a guarantee. It's equity. It's risky. The cost benefit equation to the company is also uncertain in the sense that, you know, we are handing out a little bit of additional ownership to bring everyone into the ownership of the company. And the benefit really depends on how good the leadership is at taking a more stable, engaged employee base and really driving the business forward. There are some trade-offs of incentives in terms of folks at the top versus folks at the bottom inside of a company. We do give on a percentage basis a little bit less to the people at the top. It's never been a problem with me recruiting the best people to come do this. As I mentioned earlier, there really is a big service component to leadership, which this taps into. So it's never been an issue, but there are people out there who say, you know, all the ownership should be in the hands of 5 people and no one else matters in terms of moving a business forward. That's not what I believe, obviously. And then this risk of companies faking it, which is why we need a real standard setting organization. So I'm going to stop there. Nan, I appreciate everybody listening to me. I'm happy to take this wherever you want to from here, Nan.
So thanks, Peter. You know, you have a fabulous podcast on this, but it's different to hear you presenting in a different format, and I've learned so much more, which is terrific. We have a number of questions and comments. So one is from one of our board members, Rebecca Patterson from Bridgewater. This seems like such a great idea. Aside from the potential pushback from giving transparencies, what other pushbacks have you gotten? What's been the biggest hurdle to getting this broadly rolled out? You know, there was another question from someone who said, how are you recruiting companies to join this movement? And so I should have asked that one first, because Rebecca's, you know, asking then, as you're rolling out, what are the hurdles?
Great. In terms of, and I remember Rebecca from, God, I want to say JP Morgan, or I forget where she was before Bridgewater, but I interacted with her many years ago. Pushback is lower income employees won't understand equity, won't value it. This is a waste of money. I would say that's conventional wisdom is, and it's not coming from a place of, geez, they're stupid and they can't understand it. I've not heard like, you know, that kind of a vibe, but it's more, it's just there's not a good return there. And I have some empathy for that, for the view that it's hard to get performance out of this, because if you're an employee and you're working on a manufacturing line, can you really move the stock price? I mean, is that possible? So I understand kind of the distance from someone in a manufacturing shop floor to what we're talking about. But I'm trying to come at this from a totally different perspective, which is we all say as a society, we want to get out of shareholder primacy and away from Milton Friedman. So if we really mean it, this is the right thing to do. It also happens to be good business, I believe, but start from the point of, it's not a good way to run the economy or run a company to have 5 people create all the wealth. It's just stupid and it's wrong. So that's kind of where I start. And then the second part is, I do believe it happens to be good business. What I have been able to prove with no doubt, employee retention goes up, people quit less often. Absenteeism goes down, people, and that's a real thing in manufacturing, people just don't show up for work every day. That is an issue. Absenteeism goes down and measured employee engagement scores go up. That's a fact. That's like indisputable. We've done this for 11 years. What I can't prove is how much that allows us to execute on operational improvement initiatives to a better degree, because you've got to, it's logical, but that's where I need Harvard and JPAL and these folks to help me measure what is the cost of low employee engagement, what is the cost of high employee turnover. There's no question it's a big cost, but we need to measure it. But that's the biggest pushback is what I mentioned, low income workers. This is a mistake. They're not going to value the ownership. They're not going to understand it. And that's where I mentioned earlier, it comes down to the leadership. This all starts with leadership. How good is your leadership team at explaining this and bringing people on the journey? And are they confident enough to open up the books and say, here it is. And I'm a good enough leader to work through the challenges that are going to come from, open book management and just letting everyone know where we're going, how we're going to get there, et cetera. So those are a few thoughts on the pushback.
I'm wondering if we look at this from the other side. That would be from the sales side. What about from the employee side? Are they reluctant? And I know that you have been doing financial education as part of this. And there's a question from our mutual friend Kim about that. And if you could talk a little bit about the kinds, how you realized that was an important thing to do, and how you're implementing that, because very often people have had no exposure to even the language and vocabulary of the things that we're talking about. As one young woman once said to me, my family didn't have assets, so we didn't talk about any of this. It's not that we weren't interested, but we knew where the paycheck was going, and it was to the basics. So what led you to address this, and what are the kinds of initiatives that you're implementing in the companies, and how's that going?
Yeah. So on your first question, is there pushback from the employees? Not pushback. I would say there's deep skepticism and cynicism. So whether you're a private equity firm or if it's a public company, and Jochen Zeitz at Harley Davidson, goes to roll this out, you're definitely going to get give me a break. This company doesn't care about me. I've been, at this company for a long time, and nobody's ever treated me with respect. And so there is that. I mean, the plight of low-income workers has been, as we all know, a downhill trend for some time. So you need to walk into this with some expectation that this is not, you're not going to announce this and people say, hallelujah, this is amazing. So you're going to have to do what you say you're going to do. You're going to have to live up to your commitments, and people are going to have to see you doing that. And then over, 3 years, people will say, okay, I think I'm getting to be a believer. And eventually the believers drown out the naysayers. You're still going to have the naysayers, but eventually when you win is when people on the shop floor turn to their colleague and say, hey, you know what, shut up. This is actually good for us, and I don't want to hear you complaining anymore. And then you win. On the financial education side, I mentioned earlier some of the feedback on the shop floor, and then some of these great moments, which ended up being almost embarrassing moments for me, that we had not done the financial education part. And so what we do now is there's two sides to it. There's the almost a corporate finance training of like, hey, we're going to share with you the business plan at a high level, of course, but you're going to need to understand what we're talking about. So we're going to teach you, we talk about revenue and EBITDA and CapEx and working capital. One of the examples we talked very publicly about at Ingersoll Rand was we had made every employee owner. At the time, we only had 6,000 employees. Not only, that's a lot. We had 6,000 employees at the time, and we'd made everyone an owner. And the company had gone public, and we went to our research analyst community and we said, now watch this. We're going to show you how with 6,000 employee owners, we can do things other companies can't. And we're going to pick net working capital, inventory, receivables, and payables. We trained 6,000 people on this in a train the trainer approach. And we drove in like a year, $200 million of cash freed up in working capital, which paid for basically every share of equity we'd ever given away to low-income employees. So that is the corporate finance training. And then there's the personal finance training about, which everyone on this call would be super familiar with, which is the key is the confidential one-on-one counseling. That's really for us where we've seen the big impact. The workshops are great, but when people can sit and talk about their finances in a way that they're comfortable and get on a plan, that's where we've seen, big impacts around credit score improvements, et cetera.
So would you classify then financial education as part of the special sauce for you guys? And also you talked about a lot of the different variations of these kinds of employee plans. What is the rest of the special sauce that makes your plan workable, tenable, that'll make it saleable to other private equity firms and investors to make this broad, widely spread?
Yeah. So financial education is a part of what we do. We view it as, there's many legs to the stool, but ownership going with financial training, we think, and education is key. So those are a pair to us. And then the other parts of the special sauce I mentioned earlier, it's all the leadership is so critical. I mean, if you've got great leadership and they want to operate this way, and it's a lot of extra effort and time and communication, and there are some of those awkward conversations where you put up, the revenue growth for the quarter and it's up 10%, and people just got their wage increases and they're 3.5%. And those are all the kinds of things that your leadership team has got to be prepared to, to talk about and kind of get into it with. But I would say it's all of this in totality. It's not any one thing that's going to move a culture and have employees feel valued and respected. But it does start with ownership. If you share ownership and share information about your business, to me, it's the ultimate sign of respect and trust. I respect you and trust you enough to share this information with you. And I want to treat you like an owner and a colleague.
So, comment from another friend of CE's who's also an investor. And I just want to say that he said, bravo, great initiative. And he's asking about how you deal with the tax impacts on the employees. He had some other notes there, but I think you understand where this question is coming from.
Yep.
Perhaps your vehicle is a little different from traditional ESOPs and how that's managed.
Yeah. So from a tax standpoint, we don't get the tax benefit from a corporate perspective. So a full ESOP would pay no federal income taxes, and we don't use that structure. I'd love to have that tax benefit and pass it on to our employees, but we don't structure it that way for lots of reasons. The key thing for us from an employee perspective, which is where I think the question was coming from, is you don't want the employees to get a bad tax answer where they get phantom income and they get a tax burden and there's no cash. So we structure it in ways to very carefully avoid that, whether it's a private company or if it's a public company. When we are converting the stock into tradable shares, we're distributing the shares on a net basis. So that is something we pay a lot of attention to and are very careful about.
That's great. So you're trying to sell this, you had a slide where you're talking about the rollout plan, but obviously going to the other big players that are like KKR makes sense. How are you pitching it to them? And is this a partner by partner pitch? Is it a corporate pitch to the ESG folks there? Is it more hand-to-hand combat with each group, or with the CEOs? How are you going about this?
Yeah.
This first part is the hardest part, right? Getting that critical mass there.
Yep. So, and I don't know if we're doing this the best way or not, but it's a little bit hand-to-hand combat. So it is talking to other GPs where I say, just try this. I'll help you. I'll help you through it. Experiment with it, see how it goes. And then if you like it, you can roll it out. So there's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of an outbound calling effort, both with private companies and with public companies. There's also an inbound. I'm working with a very large industrial manufacturer who wants to follow in the heels of Harley Davidson. There are some smaller public industrial companies who are looking at this. There are some distribution businesses that are public, that are large, that I'm talking to. There's a retailer that's large that is public that I'm talking to. So it's inbound and outbound, kind of hand-to-hand combat, to use your term. There are opportunities. There'll be an announcement, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned the Wall Street Journal tomorrow or the next day, about a company that the documentary film is going to be about. We are doing that transaction is a partnership with another large firm. And that's an opportunity, right? Where we say, this is the only way we do it with a company like this. We'd love to do it with you. Let's be partners. We'll do it together. And so that's a way to kind of bring other GPs into this. There's other ideas I'm kicking around, like as an example, take that garage door company that I talked about. You know, we've been working on this for years and have really changed the culture. So when we sell it, and it would likely go to a private equity firm, I think I've got some work to do on this. So I'm sharing this before it's fully baked. But I think what I'd like to try is, you know, any private equity firm, of course, is welcome, but you've got to continue this program. You know, if you don't want to operate this in this way, this is not the business for you. And I would argue to our investors, those folks wouldn't pay the highest price anyway, because they're not going to value what we've built here. And there's plenty of Delaware law precedent for, as an example, corporate entities who sell divisions requiring buyers to maintain benefits for years after the sale. So, you know, I think we'd be on solid ground. And I think our investors would support this anyway. But I could imagine a day where, as this spreads inside of our firm, and we say, hey, if you want to buy our companies, you got to continue it. And when you buy one of our companies, what you're getting is a more stable employee base, a more engaged employee base, an ownership mindset and culture, and you have to continue it. So I think there's lots of ways. This is going to take years, Nan, but I think there's lots of ways that we can infect the market with this, and hopefully have it spread like a virus.
I'm not sure I'd use exactly that analogy, but maybe in a year or so it'll be a little bit more positive memory. So you touched briefly in your presentation on government policy and a little bit of advocacy. What are the kinds of things you might like to be advocating for at a state or federal level?
So I've spoken to maybe a handful of senators about things that we could do at the federal level. One would be, you know, corporate tax rates are going up. Maybe they should go up differentially depending on how broadly distributed ownership is or how concentrated ownership is. That's I don't know if that's a good idea, but that's an idea, you know, maybe that's worth studying. The ESOP legislation, and this, I would say there's a number of senators who are tuned into some of the flaws in the ESOP legislation from 1974. It's ESOPs as a plan sit in the Department of Labor because it's an ERISA benefit, which I think is a mistake. I think it should not be an ERISA benefit, should not be in 401ks, and it should be under the SEC. So if I could draw it up, you know, the Department of Labor oversight scares off some people from converting. There's lots of complexities with that. I think the way that the governance has to work with an ESOP is complicated and could be simplified from the ESOP trustee perspective. I think the redemption requirements are too great. You're seeing ESOPs de-ESOPing under the weight of these redemption requirements, and there's a bunch of other things. So that there's a whole ESOP component to this. And then the last one is that I'll mention is from an SEC disclosure perspective. I would like to see more disclosure around how low-income workers are treated. Starting with basics like safety. You're reporting safety anyway to OSHA. Why wouldn't we ask people to put it in their 10K? Why wouldn't we ask people to disclose employee turnover? If I'm a public investor, I'd want to know. It tells me something about your culture. And then give more disclosure around your equity plan. Right now, you just basically have to say the size of the plan and what do the named executive officers get. It doesn't really tell you much. You know, when we dug in, when we took Gardner Denver private and there were 6,000 employees and 80 had ownership, that was pretty shocking. And I just don't know the extent to which people understand how ownership's distributed in some of these companies.
So you showed some data that was truly remarkable and referenced it about the numbers going up. on retention, engagement, all of the things that people are always asked to prove on any initiative that's meant to help people, but you've done it. And you've shared some amazing stories. I mean, the videos were great. That first Yelp that went up was just made me smile. What's been in this journey over the last 11 years? And you said, you weren't expecting that, but has there been one or two particularly special moments that really just made you look up and say, Dad, we did it?
Oh God. I feel like we haven't done anything yet. So I don't have a lot of those moments where I say, hey, we've done it. I feel like we are in the 1 yard line of where we need to get. I think if we see one of those domino effects start to happen, I think that would be a moment where we would say, holy cow, because the bad part, there's a bad part about our society where there's tremendous, not only wealth concentration, but decision-making concentration. I mean, we have, which is not great. The positives that where we could spin that though and say, hey, this is an opportunity, is take private equity, the top 10 private equity firms. I'm going to make this up because I don't know. They must be we must be responsible for millions of employees. It's got to be 5 or 6 million employees. So if you got 10 decision makers to make a decision around wealth inequality and what they're going to do for broad-based ownership, it's like 6 million people. So that's where I would maybe start to say, okay, we've gotten somewhere. Right now, this is skunk's work. We've done this with 10 companies, big deal. So long way to go.
Is there on a more micro level, is there one story that an employee shared with you that has been super special to you?
Well, I'll tell you one that was special, but also just very interesting to me. It was an interesting debate we had at the board. So when we were taking Gardner Denver, which is now known as Ingersoll Rand public, it's a huge debate about, should we require employees to retain some of their stock? So, we're going public and there's going to be, I forget what the number was at the time, over $100 million of equity in the hands of our lower income workers. And geez, what if they sell it? And then they're not really tied to the company. There's no cultural benefit. And my argument was always, if they need to sell it, they should sell it. We should be honest with them that we think the stock is going to, we have so much upside and the stock has gone from 20 to 50. So it's been a great performer. And one of our colleagues wrote me a letter and said, first of all, I want to thank the company, Gardner Denver, and all of you for what you've done for my family. My story is probably not what you want to hear, in the sense that I got my stock and I sold it all. And I sold it all because I and my wife were in student debt in a level that we thought we would never get out of. There was no daylight. We were dead. And we just couldn't get enough income to do more than pay the interest. And we weren't going to have a family. I mean, our lives, I was depressed. I was on medication. I would come into work and I couldn't focus. And now, it's not like all my problems are gone, but I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We can see a way out of this. We haven't paid down all of our debt, but we're on our way. And, it's been life impacting.
That is wonderful. And on that very upbeat note, I want to say thank you so much, not just for joining us here this evening, but for this tremendous initiative. So many people talk about wealth inequality, and this is a very tangible, focused action that can really make a difference, and all the way across the board. Make companies healthy, keep jobs here, and keep people engaged in their work and benefiting not just their companies, but themselves as well. So it's kind of a win-win from my perspective. I'm so looking forward to seeing you in about a month with some of our other honorees at our Visionary Awards on June 9th, Paula Vallant and Raj Chetty, who wrote the data set on wealth inequality and income mobility and economic mobility. So I think that's going to be a great event. Thanks again for your time, efforts, and energy overall for this great initiative, and with us at CE. We deeply appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Nan. Thanks for everything you're doing. And thanks for the opportunity to tell the story a little bit. Look forward to seeing you in a month.